The moment itself is invisible. No speech is given. No treaty is signed. No dramatic reversal makes headlines. The invasion simply never happens. Troops remain stationed. Intelligence briefings stay tense. Maps are studied. Scenarios rehearsed. Red lines debated. The world holds its breath, then exhales as weeks pass, then months. Nothing crosses the border. First, it feels like delay. Analysts talk about restraint, bargaining, miscalculation avoided at the last second. Markets relax cautiously. Diplomats congratulate themselves in private. The crisis becomes background noise. The illusion holds because history has trained the world to expect inevitability. When pressure builds this visibly, action is assumed. So when action does not come, people search for hidden motives. A trick, a longer game, a future shock postponed. But the shock never arrives. Ukraine continues living in a state of readiness that slowly turns into routine. Sirens remain silent. Cities do not empty. Families do not scatter across borders. Life continues under tension, but intact. Russia, meanwhile, chooses containment over catastrophe. Not out of compassion, out of calculation. Inside the Kremlin, the decision is framed as patience. Influence without occupation. Pressure without destruction. Power exercised through leverage rather than fire. The world does not reward this restraint loudly. It barely notices. Sanctions remain threatened but unrealized. Energy flows continue. Trade hums. Europe breathes easier without admitting why. The absence of war feels like normalcy rather than achievement. This is the first consequence. Peace does not feel historic. It feels forgettable. Ukraine changes quietly. Without invasion, it does not become a global symbol overnight. There are no viral images of resistance, no heroic narratives forged in ruins. Instead, there is slow reform, uneven progress, corruption battles that do not trend, democracy that matures without applause. It is harder this way. There is no unifying trauma to accelerate identity. Nationhood grows through bureaucracy, compromise, frustration. Takes longer. It is less cinematic, but it is real. Ukraine integrates economically with Europe piece by piece, not as a cause but as a partner.
NATO discussion continue cautiously.
Security guarantees remain ambiguous. The country lives in the uncomfortable middle, neither attacked nor fully protected. Russia benefits from this ambiguity. Influence persists through economics, media, political pressure. Oligarchs maneuver. Energy remains a tool. Soft power does what tanks never could without consequence. Inside Russia, something subtle shifts. Without war, there is no mobilization of fear. No rally around the flag effect. No external enemy vivid enough to drown internal stagnation. The system continues, but without the adrenaline of conflict. That becomes a problem. Younger generations grow restless, not rebellious, but bored. The promise of restored greatness feels vague without visible confrontation.
National Pride lac spectacle.
The government compensates with narratives, cultural revival, historical memory, controlled nationalism without bloodshed. It works partially, but something is missing. War simplifies stories. Without it, complexity leaks back in. Europe changes differently. Without invasion, unity remains theoretical. Defense budgets rise slowly, unevenly. Energy dependence is discussed, not severed. Climate goals compete with comfort. The urgency that would have forced transformation never materializes. Peace delays progress. The United States pivots gradually. Focus shifts to Asia. Ukraine remains important, but not existential. Aid flows steadily, not dramatically.
Démocratie promotion stekosiu, calculated.
The global order remains strained, but intact. No rapture. No before and after moment. And that may be the most profound difference. History continues in lowercase. No cities destroyed. No mass graves.
No millions displaced.
But also no moral clarity. No moment when the world is forced to choose sides clearly and permanently. No line drawn that cannot be erased later. The psychological impact is subtle but deep. People never confront the cost of aggression because aggression never happens. The lesson remains theoretical. Deterrence is assumed to work, not proven. Authoritarianism learns something dangerous. You can push without breaking. You can threaten without acting. You can reshape borders of influence without crossing borders of law. The absence of war becomes a strategy. Ukraine remains vigilant. Society hardens, but slowly. Civil defense becomes a background skill, not a lived necessity. Patriotism grows through language, culture, policy, not survival. Some feel relief. Others feel something close to resentment, because suffering, while horrific, forges certainty. Without it, doubt persists. Russia's future drifts. The leadership ages. Succession questions loom. Without war to freeze the system in emergency mode, internal pressures accumulate. Economic stagnation becomes harder to mask. Legitimacy erodes quietly. Change becomes more likely, but slower. And slower change is harder to predict than explosions. The world, looking back years later, struggles to name this timeline. It is not a victory, not a tragedy, not a turning point. It is a near miss that reshaped nothing dramatically and everything gradually. Ukraine survives without becoming a symbol. Russia maintains power without proving it. The global order avoids fracture, but also avoids renewal. And beneath this long, quiet continuation, a realization settles among historians and strategists alike. The war that did not happen did not spare the world from consequences. It redistributed them across decades instead of months, across institutions instead of cities, across psychology instead of ruins. This was not peace as triumph. It was restraint as delay, a fundamental loss. The loss of the moment that would have forced the world to confront what it truly values, what it will defend, and what it is willing to sacrifice to stop aggression when it is still only a possibility. And this is only the beginning of what happens when a war everyone expected never arrives, and leaves the world to deal with the tension it never resolved. Time passes, and the world begins to understand what did not happen. The numbers emerge slowly, not as statistics of loss, but as absences, columns that never needed to be filled. Analysts compare timelines, models, probabilities. They estimate outcomes that never materialized and try to measure lives that were never put at risk. The figures are imperfect, but they are not imaginary. In this timeline, millions of people remain where they were born. Cities function as cities, not evacuation routes. Schools teach mathematics instead of trauma. Hospitals treat illness instead of mass casualties. Demographers run counterfactual models. If the war had happened, they estimate Ukraine alone could have lost hundreds of thousands of lives directly and indirectly within the first years. Soldiers, civilians, the elderly, the sick, those caught in infrastructure collapse. In this world, those people grow older. Some die anyway of ordinary causes at ordinary times. But not all at once. Not violently. Not anonymously. Refugee columns never form. In the war that didn't happen timeline, 10 million people never cross borders in panic. European cities never strain under emergency housing. Families are not split across continents. Children do not grow up speaking languages learned in exile. The psychological cost never compounds. A generation avoids trauma that would have shaped its politics, its art, its fertility, its trust. Mental health systems are not overwhelmed. Entire cohorts do not grow up calibrated to fear.
Ukraine's population curve bandifranly.
Instead of a sudden drop followed by slow recovery, it stabilizes. Birth rates remain low, as in much of Europe, but not catastrophic. Young people stay. Professionals build lives at home instead of starting over elsewhere. The economy tells the quietest story. Without war, Ukraine's GDP does not collapse and rebound. It grows slowly, frustratingly, unevenly, but continuously. Infrastructure ages instead of being destroyed and rebuilt. Capital compounds instead of being reset. This is less dramatic and more powerful. Foreign investment arrives cautiously, not heroically. No emergency aid packages dominate headlines. Instead, long-term contracts are signed. Supply chains integrate gradually. Corruption is fought in committee rooms, not under sirens. Russia's numbers look different too. In this timeline, hundreds of thousands of young Russian men never die or return wounded. Families do not receive folded flags. Regions do not lose entire age cohorts. Demographic decline remains serious, but not accelerated by mass casualty. The economy avoids sudden isolation. Sanctions never reach their most severe form. Energy exports continue largely uninterrupted. Revenue flows sustain the system longer. The ruble never experiences shock collapses. Inflation hurts, but predictably, this stability comes at a cost. Without war, there is no rupture to justify reform or repression at scale. The political system remains locked in managed stagnation. Elites age in place. Innovation lags. Corruption persists without the cover of emergency. Russia does not break. It ossifies. Europe avoids shock as well. Energy prices rise gradually instead of exploding. Governments debate diversification rather than racing to replace supply overnight. Climate targets are missed quietly, not abandoned publicly. Defense spending increases, but slowly. NATO unity remains theoretical. Without invasion, there is no visceral reminder of vulnerability. Security becomes a talking point, not a lived fear. The alliance exists but does not transform. This is the hidden cost of peace. Without crisis, systems rarely change. Global food markets remain more stable. In the war that didn't happen world, grain exports continue uninterrupted. Price spikes never hit the poorest countries as hard. Political instability in distant regions is dampened rather than inflamed. Some governments never fall. Some protests never turn violent. The ripple effects of absence spread outward. The United States avoids another proxy conflict. Military aid budgets are allocated elsewhere. Political polarization lacks a unifying external focus. Domestic tensions remain unresolved, but not displaced. China watches carefully. The lesson learned is not about deterrence through force, but influence through patience. Power exercised without invasion proves effective. The precedent is subtle and dangerous. Authoritarian systems everywhere take note. You do not need tanks to reshape outcomes. You need endurance, ambiguity, economic gravity. The absence of war becomes a playbook. Years later, historians argue over whether this timeline is better. There is no pile of ruins to point at and say, never again dash. There is no shared trauma to anchor memory. The world drifts uneasy but intact. Ukraine remains sovereign, but not sanctified. Russia remains powerful, but not exposed. The global order survives, but unchanged, and that may be the deepest consequence. In the timeline where invasion never happens, humanity avoids immense suffering, but also avoids reckoning. No red lines are crossed, so none are enforced. Aggression remains a concept rather than a crime with consequences. Deterrence is assumed to work. Until it doesn't, people who lived through this era remember it as tense, ambiguous, unresolved. A long breath held and never fully released. Anxiety without release becomes background stress. The world never learns what it is willing to sacrifice to stop expansionism, because it is never asked. Looking back, analysts estimate that in this non-war timeline, millions of lives were not shortened, not displaced, not traumatized. But they also note something harder to measure: the cost of avoidance. Without war, moral clarity never arrives. Without destruction, renewal never forces itself. Systems that needed pressure to change remain comfortable enough to persist. Peace spares lives. It also preserves structures. This was not the best possible world. It was the least catastrophic one. A world where suffering was minimized, but meaning was deferred. Where tragedy was avoided, but lessons were postponed. The war that did not happen saved lives. It also saved illusions. And as decades pass without rupture, the question that lingers is not what was avoided, but what was never confronted. This was not victory. It was postponement, a different kind of risk. And the world, living with the consequences of a crisis that never forced resolution, learns too late that some conflicts, if not faced, do not disappear. They wait,